Well, I'm going to go ahead and start since we're right at 10 o'clock. Good morning and welcome. Thank you all for being here with us this morning. My name is Melissa Sadorf. I am the superintendent of the Stanfield Elementary School District in Pinal County, and I also serve on the ARSA Executive Board as the president-elect. Sean?
Good morning. My name is Sean Rickert, and I'm the superintendent at Pima Unified School District out here in Eastern Arizona. And I also am on the Rural Schools Association Executive Board as the advocacy coordinator and the Southeast Arizona rep. I also sit on the National Rural Education Association Executive Committee as the active superintendent representative. It's a pleasure to see so many of you out today. So yeah, thank you.
Just a few housekeeping things. I know we're all old pros by now at Zoom, but just to remind you, if you're not speaking, please make sure that you're muted. And you can always use the chat feature throughout. We encourage you to ask questions. You can certainly raise your hand, unmute yourself. We want it to be an interactive conversation for certain. But if you have questions that you'd rather put in the chat, I'll be monitoring that. And we will be recording this session so that it is available for viewing at a later date and time for you. So with that, Sean, do you want to go ahead and introduce our guest of honor, please?
Sure. Every month, we try to come up with topics that we feel would be interesting to rural superintendents and education leaders. And right now, as we're all starting in the process of developing our fiscal year 22 budgets, we thought that it would be advantageous to have the opportunity to hear some sage wisdom and a little information, and as well as getting the opportunity to maybe ask some questions of Mr. Chuck Essigs from the Arizona Association of School Business Officials. Chuck has been their government relations director for longer than he probably cares to admit, but has acquired quite the level of information and expertise. He's somebody that has always been wonderfully accessible to superintendents, and is a great resource. If you haven't met Chuck yet, which I'm sure most of you have, but if you haven't, it's our pleasure to introduce him to you, and to give him the opportunity to share some thoughts on what's happening right now in the legislature and what are the things to look out for as we're planning for the future. Thank you, Chuck.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I assume sage is a polite way of saying old, and
Yeah,
having a lot of information to share is a polite way of saying he's full of it because of all the time that he spent doing these things. But anyway, I worked in the Mesa School District for 20 years. I'm retired from there, and now I've been working for the school business officials for almost 20 years. So it's a really good organization, and we really appreciate it. And I understand the challenges that districts are facing. This year, it's probably 10 times more difficult than it's ever been because of all the unknowns. And I won't be able to answer a lot of the unknowns, but at least I can share with you what information we do have. So we have a first slide here, just to get started talking about some of the school funding issues. First, I want to talk about the classroom site fund for this year and what it looks like for next year. It's looking very positive for next year. If you go back on the classroom site fund for this year, you had $425 per weighted student was your allocation for every district and every charter school. And when the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, and we'll talk a little bit later about what they'll do on March 30th, which will give you the really good numbers for going forward into fiscal year 22. But when they did this year's estimate, they did it back in March of 2020, the end of March, and that was a dismal time. That was right in the roaring start of the pandemic. Schools were closed. People at that point thought the state budget was going to be decimated. They thought sales tax numbers were going to be way down. So when they did their estimate, they were very, very, very conservative, which is a good thing that they did, but it's going to help the picture for next year, because the estimate that they gave for this year was $425 per weighted student count. And if you'll remember, that included an extra $40 for teacher salaries, because as part of the last year of the teacher 20% salary increase, there was extra money given to schools into the classroom site fund that came out of money that was used for the state paying off debt that they had when they borrowed money for Students First. And that was a one-time effort. And that increased that base level by $40, and it was $50 million of extra money. That $50 million for next year, and we've sent out an email or two on this, will actually not be in the classroom site fund anymore. It will go into the base level funding formula, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So there's an extra $40 million that under normal terms, the classroom site fund would go down, because the $40 million that's in that 425 amount for this year is not going to be there for next year. I don't know what the exact numbers are going to be. And what I always tell people, my advice is to wait until you get the official number from the Joint Legislative Budget Committee at the end of March before you give people an estimate. Because if you give them an estimate, and wherever you got it from, whether I gave it to you or somebody else, it's just going to be an estimate, and the final number will be either higher or lower than that. And the final number, if it's higher than that, people may think that you intentionally gave a low estimate because you wanted to not show them all the dollars were there. If it comes out lower than that, what that estimate is, they think they lost something that they never really had. So I strongly encourage people to wait until the official estimate comes out on March 30th. But it looks like sales tax receipts didn't tank. In fact, they moved in the other direction. The retail and remote sales taxes for year to date this year over last year, it's up about 16.8%. Contracting sales tax is up over 20%. People are staying home and remodeling their houses, or there's a whole bunch of construction going on. So the only thing that's pulling it down a little bit is restaurants and bars. They're down about 11%, but everything else is way up. So there's going to be more sales tax monies coming in for when they do their estimate and projecting it into next year. Secondly, there's going to be a pretty big carryover in the classroom site fund, I believe, because the legislature, the JLBC, did such a really conservative estimate. There's going to actually be more money coming in than what you're allowed to spend, because once you get that March 30th number, you can spend to that number, whether more money comes in or less money comes in. That's a good thing. So, but doing a really conservative estimate, any additional monies that came in that were unexpected for this year will get carried over into next year. So it'll probably be a good year for the increase in the classroom site fund. I guess we need all the help we can get, but it should look really good when it comes out at the end of March. And later on, when I talk about a few of the legislative bills, I'll talk about one that will also help people, districts administer the classroom site fund, if that legislation passes all the way through. Prop 208, that's Invest in Ed. That's the extra tax on people making higher 250,000 individually or over $500,000 on a joint return. There was a lawsuit that was filed in December, and the legislature and a couple of business people asked the judge to enjoin that law from happening. They were basically making a couple of arguments. One of the arguments why they wanted the judge to enjoin and stop that legislation or that initiative from going forward is that their arguments, which the judge eventually didn't buy and didn't allow the state to enjoin that law from that initiative from happening. But basically they were arguing that only the legislature can increase taxes. And obviously this was done by a citizens initiative. And if the citizens were doing something, they should have to do it with a supermajority, since the legislature can only raise taxes with a supermajority. The judge ruled that neither one of those appeared to have much value or had a good argument behind them. It doesn't mean it won't get litigated further on, but he didn't think there was enough argument there to allow him to enjoin the law from happening. So the law actually went in place. The second thing the state was arguing in the lawsuit is that, well, because we have an aggregate spending limit on schools, they wouldn't be able to spend this money anyway. And the judge didn't buy that argument either. He said that, well, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. So the good thing is that the judge did not give the state what they wanted. And it just ruled recently, a week or so ago on that, but that's a good thing and a good ruling. So what's happening now is the tax is in place. So, but the problem is until people actually file their taxes next spring in March and April, or some people who get extensions on their income tax, until they actually file their tax form, the state won't know exactly how much additional money is being collected because people aren't paying it separately right now. What people are paying is, in a number of cases, estimated taxes. So there is some of that that is coming out in the estimated income taxes that's going into the state general fund, but so the tax is in place, but there, 1 second here. Sorry about that. The tax is in place, and where is the money? Money's going into the state treasurer's office because it's kept separately in the state treasurer's office. But right now, we don't know, and no one knows exactly how much that is, because we won't really know until people start filing their taxes next spring. So the distribution to school districts, obviously there isn't any money that's being distributed because it's not identified how much would actually be there and how much would be available to be distributed. But the money is going into the treasurer's office based upon estimated taxes. And when people file their taxes next spring in March or April, then the state will actually know how much is there. What appears will happen then is, since no one will really know until next spring how many dollars are being distributed, no money will be distributed until that information is available, which some of it would be available next March, some of it would be available next April, some of it wouldn't be, where later would be later than that when people got their income, actually did their income taxes, they got extensions. But the other thing that fits into the initiative, the way the initiative is written, the treasurer who gets the money distributes it by a formula, and basically that the treasurer takes any money that they get deposited by the Department of Revenue with the treasurer's office. They distribute that money on January 1, December, the end of December, and the end of June 30th. So really the first time there'll really be much money coming in and being available to be distributed would most likely be on June 30th, which means for the fiscal 22 school year, that money isn't probably going to be there right until maybe the very end of that. So it looks like it's the fiscal year 23, the 22-23 school year before that money will actually be distributed. That's just an estimate at this point in time, because there'll be other lawsuits filed and there'll be other arguments made, but it looks like it won't be next school year. It would be the following school year before some of those dollars would start showing up. On the aggregate spending limit, the issue on that is the aggregate spending limit has a provision in it that it grants to school districts are exempt from the aggregate limit. Doesn't matter where they come from. When they're grants, they're exempt from the limit. And since Prop 208 clearly states that the money that school districts will be receiving are grants, that money should be exempt from the aggregate limit. So where the lawsuit kind of stopped because the judge didn't rule in the state's favor, both of those arguments appear to be pretty strong to that judge. Will the state file additional lawsuits? They most likely will. But they will have to wait and see how that actually works out.
So Chuck, let me just
Yes.
make sure. You said the first time that funds could be available to be distributed would be June 30th of 2022.
That's correct.
But there will likely be a limit on how much would be available at that time, because you won't have complete tax receipts from calendar year 21 at that point. People still.
But I'm sorry, you probably have a lot of it. So that first June 30th distribution would be a fairly large distribution, because it's all of the money that would have been collected in tax year 21, and that people have filed their returns on by June 30th. So it could be that first one. There'll still be monies that'll come in after that, because people will get extensions on filing their taxes. But even when they file their taxes, they should be paying all the taxes that they owe. The only problem the state may have is they won't know how much is coming from the surcharge and how much is coming from the regular taxes that people have to pay. So June 30th of 22 would be a pretty significant amount of money.
But that's now, let me, and again, just as far as just trying to understand process here. I mean, on June 30th, that's when the Department of Revenue would make a payment to ADE, school finance.
Well, it never goes to school finance. And
Okay.
A couple of things, the Department of Revenue, the law doesn't address that clearly, but it would appear that when they receive the money, they move it to the treasurer's office. So they don't wait until June 30th to distribute the money to the treasurer. The Department of Revenue, it would appear, when people file their taxes, people pay their taxes. Let's say you paid $10,000 in taxes or whatever it may be. They would take what share of that would go to the state general fund, which is where most income taxes go, and what share of that would go because of Prop 208 goes to the treasurer's office. The treasurer actually distributes the money directly to school districts. And in reality, it goes to the county treasurers from the state treasurer's office, but it never goes through the hands of the Department of Ed. That's an important thing to look at, because when they do the aggregate spending limit, that helps reinforce the fact that this is clearly a grant, because it doesn't go to the Department of Ed. It goes from the treasurer directly to the county treasurers to the credit of the school districts.
So I'm reflecting back on the fact that, we had, Congress approved, billions of dollars for K-12 education. The state of Arizona then had to get, it takes weeks, right? Weeks here, weeks there, and they all add up. Time to figure out how much the state of Arizona gets, and then they figure out how much goes to each LEA, and all of a sudden it's the middle of February before that money that was approved back in December actually, we even know how much it is, and then you've got all your issues as far as getting it in the bank. So if this is a grant, is it going to be are we looking at something that's going to be run through an eCivis type grant process connected to APHIS? Or is this, are we just going to, how are they going to determine how much each district is eligible for? And because it's based on the number of teachers?
Nope. Let me go through the distribution process, and those are all good questions, and I want to make it clear, I'm answering from what I think. You know, there's other attorneys who will be looking at this or whatever, but this is a pretty simple process. First, let's track it from the beginning. The Department of Revenue will determine how much of people's taxes are attributable to that extra surcharge on the amount above 250 and the amount above 500,000, which is a fairly simple mathematic process. Once you get people's taxes in, there's going to have to be something on that tax form that identifies what people are paying for one point and the other. That money goes to the treasurer's office. Now the treasurer has that. The distribution to school districts there's three, they're not, I guess they're like buckets, but they're actually three separate components. And the first one is, of all that money that comes in, they distribute 50% of it to school districts. And that is to go for, it's kind of for classroom expenses. It's basically for hiring and paying teachers and classroom support personnel, compensation, and hiring additional people. So the Auditor General, we believe, will set up a fund, either one fund with three components to it or probably separate funds. So the treasurer calculates for each district, and this is important too, because this is the first time this has ever been done in distribution. This gets distributed on weighted student count, including Group B. So the Classroom Site Fund is weighted student count just with Group A, your elementary and high school. That was intentional. In talking to the people who put the initiative together, our recommendation to them was to use the total weighted student count, including Group B. So if a district has more disabled students, has higher total weighted student count, that will give them more money, obviously, because it's basically what percentage your Group B weighted student count is of the total weighted student count in the state, which is pretty much the way the Classroom Site Fund's done. But it's important for people to understand it's the Group A and Group B weighted student counts combined. So the treasurer then will send that money out to the school districts based upon, I would assume they'll get some help from the Department of Ed mathematically calculating that. But it would be district, if you're District A, what percentage is your total weighted student count of the total weighted student count for the state for districts and charters? I take 50% of the money and distribute it to school districts based upon that. And then the 25% goes to, which kind of it's student support services. So basically hiring student support services personnel, increasing base compensation for those people. So that's 25% of the money. Total amount of money from the state goes to school districts and charters. And then 10% of the total money that's collected goes to school districts, and they're to use that money for providing mentoring and retention programming for new classroom teachers. So the how the money can be spent will certainly be defined a little bit as we look at it in more detail, but basically that's where then there's some other money that goes to JTEDs for workforce development, that goes to a teacher academy. But the three big portions of money take the total amount of money, 50% goes to school districts for the classroom, 25% of the total goes to school districts for student support services, and 10% goes for retaining teachers. So it'll be a little bit different than what you're used to with grants, because it's not like it's not like you apply to somebody on how you're going to spend that money. You spend it based upon the definitions that are established.
And I think you said this already, but I just want to be clear. So when it's the weighted student count with Group B, is that based on prior year?
It'll be based on prior year.
So okay, so they'll calculate how much each district will get based on what they have available June 30th, January 1st, right? I mean,
Mhm.
at each of those dates. So, and I guess what I'm trying to get to, Chuck, is, we've seen, well, I remember back, the first 1% of the 20%, we got in a way that made it almost impossible to put it into contracts, and it ended up being stipends. And there were a lot of people that felt like that stipend approach was fairly ineffective at addressing teacher retention and recruiting concerns. And so I'm just looking at this, wondering how on earth does a school district find a way to get this money into a contract? Because it seems like it shows up well after contracts have been issued. And the best you're going to be able to do is say, hey, here's thank you for coming to work for us for what we told you we could pay. Here's some extra money that none of us could count on. You couldn't build a budget on it, but you're going to have, it doesn't necessarily help teachers to address the basic living. I mean, if you can't budget it, what good is it? It doesn't help you to buy a house. It doesn't help you to pay your bills. I don't know.
Now, if this was under a normal world, if you remember the classroom site fund, it started out where there was no official projections of how much money districts were going to get. And that was the problem. So what they did was they set up the system we have now, that the Joint Legislative Budget Committee says, this is how much money you get to spend next year. If you get less than that, you can still spend that money, and we'll adjust it in the following year. Under the current circumstances, I don't think the legislature will do that, because they're not enamored with Prop 208. I don't think they'll do much, and it's hard to speak for the legislature, but I would think that there's a member of them there that say, hey, this was an initiative, this is what passed, and you have to live with whatever that is. So certainly in the beginning, that's going to be a problem, because there's not much that can be changed. And I'll probably say it even a few more times. Remember, this is just my guess about what would actually happen. I don't have the authority to run it, but just taking the statutes that are there and looking at what happened there, this is what I think will be happening. But I do agree with you that in the first couple of years, this is going to be a problem, because it's a brand new initiative. We don't know we don't have track record of how much money would be coming in. We'll have a lot better number when that first payment comes in June of 22 for the 22-23 school year. But until then, there's going to be a lot of unknowns. But I agree with you, it's going to be a problem for those first couple of years. And maybe sometime we'll have a more friendly legislature, or maybe we'll have people who are willing to do some legislative modifications that make this a more smooth process.
And I see that Melissa put a question in the chat too. She says, what does carry forward for these funds look like? I mean, obviously, again, there's nothing set in stone, but I mean, have you heard anything on that?
Well, no, but I think what carry forward would be is whatever you get allocated to you that year and you don't spend would be carry over into the next school year, which would seem logical. But that would take, the Auditor General and some other people would have to do a more official review of that. But this money was intended to go to schools, and the schools were allowed to spend it. So I think the carryover would be similar to what the carryover is with the classroom site fund. Whatever you had available to spend, you didn't spend in the prior year, you carry that over into the next year.
Excellent.
If I was the czar of this, that's what I would do, but I'm not the czar of this, but I think that would be a logical step to follow. Remember, we don't even know exactly the total amount of funding. The people who put the initiative together, we're estimating it'd be about 900 million annually. The Joint Legislative Budget Committee did their estimate, and it would be 800 million or a little bit less than 800 million. So it's kind of interesting. 100 million in one way or 100 million the other way is the estimates on this, but it should be a very significant amount of money. And as you can see, the distribution is relatively simple. It's those three allocations for districts: classroom, student support, and then help with retaining teachers.
All right, let me ask you one more question. You probably don't know.
Okay, then you've reached your limit. No, I'm just kidding. No, these are all good questions. I'm glad to answer.
One more you probably don't know the answer to, and then I'll try to ask you some that you do. In the language from the proposition, there was a ton of supplanting references. How on earth is anybody going to track? I mean, given the process of distribution that we've just outlined, I mean, is it going to be one of those do what you do, and when somebody complains, they'll have a leg to stand on in court kind of a provision? Or is there going to be some way to audit all this? I just wonder how that works.
I don't have all the answers to that, but something that came up in the lawsuit was interesting and gives a little direction from what the judge ruled on this. Is that the state was arguing that was another reason why the initiative is unconstitutional, because it would make the legislature do certain things. So because of that supplanting requirement, the judge basically, his ruling was, and it could be appealed and changed overall, that the supplanting only applies to school districts, doesn't apply to the state. It applies to school districts. And then there's not a lot of direction beyond that. So, that one's going to have to be worked out. Hopefully the Auditor General's office and people would give some guidance to how is that going to be calculated, but it doesn't go beyond just that general statement about supplanting. And and the judge's, at least interpretation, is that doesn't apply to the state. It only applies to supplanting within school districts. And you said you had a simple question.
No, I didn't say it was simple. I said it was hard to answer, actually. So.
Okay.
But you did a wonderful job, and I appreciate it.
Okay, then we'll continue. I have a few more things on that, the general school funding issues after the distribution of classroom site fund and invest in ed. And very rarely do you get to talk about 800 million, 900 million, 700 million. So it is a significant amount of money that people worked really hard to get that on the ballot and to get it passed. But there's going to be a lot of unknowns, but at least you have a better general understanding of what's happening, and hopefully the people that are working in your school district will understand it's not your issue that's delaying when these dollars will actually be distributed. It's you're going to spend it as soon as you get it, but it's the delay is getting it out to school districts.
Yes.
The other thing is ESSER 3, and I don't have a lot of details on it now, but you're familiar with ESSER 1. You're getting familiar with ESSER 2. I would encourage people. The Department of Ed's having a webinar tomorrow. They do a really good job of trying to put all that information together. If you haven't already registered for that webinar, you should. ASBO has a webinar scheduled for March the 3rd. It's our bi-monthly meeting. It's a free webinar. And we have Karen Smith from Heinfeld and Meach and Peter Lang from the Department of Ed will be talking about ESSER 2 and how to maybe coordinate ESSER 2 and ESSER 1 and your budget together. So you should, if you haven't already registered, it's free. And that'll be on March the 3rd. Right now, we'll have to wait and see about ESSER 3. It looks like it'll be a significant amount of money. Whether it will have the same restrictions, because I've already been asked this a number of times, where that money is so closely tied to Title I distributions. Will ESSER 3 have that? I haven't seen anything on that yet, but some of the people who have been looking at it feel that it may very well have that same tie into Title I in terms of how it gets distributed. But it's going to be a significant amount of money. The Congress, they're looking maybe in the next week or so will pass that legislation because it's part of a lot larger bill. And then we'll see what happens with the House and the Senate at the national level. But ESSER 3 will be a significant amount of money, at least where it stands right now.
Yeah, I had a conversation last week with someone from National Public Radio about ESSER 3, and they were pursuing the question that many in the minority in Congress are asking, which is, gosh, school districts have already been given, K-12 education has been given $63 billion, but only $5 billion of it's been spent, and how can you say that they need more? And so Tasha Keith from NPR was asked, well, how would you respond to that? I said, well, I can identify well over $1.5 million in costs associated with things that need to be addressed to strengthen our mitigation plan and make schools safer for kids. And they only, so far we haven't seen half of that. Plus, understanding the fact that, like what we were just saying, that there's a process with getting that money all the way from allocated to expended. And that process takes time, and you want it to take time because otherwise people would have the opportunity to use that money to buy, personal vehicles and, all kinds of other things that would be inappropriate. And so but she then, pointed out, she says, yeah, while it's an interesting thought question, at the end of the day, you got to remember it doesn't really matter because they're in the minority now, and the majority party is dead set and determined to make sure that K-12 education, at least at the federal level, K-12 education is taken care of, and that the needs of schools are taken care of. So.
And what we're hearing a little bit is that some of that money has to be earmarked for opening of schools, and also that the money may extend out into fiscal year 23 in terms of when you could spend the money. So, and that's an important consideration as districts look forward. Next year, because I get calls from a number of school districts, it's going to be at this point in time, it's such a scary thought about what's going to happen with all the kids who didn't come back to school this year. Are they coming back next year? Some districts think they'll be getting some of them back. I think there'll be a big influx of kindergarten students because that was one of the areas that was way down. Parents didn't send their schools, but schools are going to face a very severe possibility of tough budget times next year with those unknowns. So hopefully some of this money can help transition people through that tough times. Just a couple of budget numbers to give to people, and at our meeting on March 3rd, and since it's for free, I'm not pushing the March 3 ASBO webinar. Obviously, we're making money on it, but there'll be a lot of good information. And we have Dale Ponder from Crane School District is kind of going through all the numbers that you need as you start to prepare your budget, as best he knows. But the base level and transportation for next year, the inflation increase that the JLBC is estimating is a 1.23%. The governor's office estimated 1.22. The JLBC, Joint Legislative Budget Committee, is a more official number, and they're using 1.23% as inflation. That could change slightly. The final number is when they adopt the budget, hopefully in April sometime, whatever. If inflation had changed, and it's for calendar year 2020 that we just finished, at the end of it, but they make modifications after the year ends, and that number could change just slightly, but 1.23%. There'll be no cuts, at least to district additional assistance for next year. All the cuts have now been wiped off the board. people ask, well, when we haven't had a fully funded district additional formula since 2009. So won't it be nice when you do your budget, whatever number comes out of that DAA calculation, you don't have to subtract from it. But there'll be no inflation increase. The charters do have an inflation increase. So that's kind of the budget. I'll talk about a couple of legislative bills and then try and answer any questions people might have on that. When will the legislature end? Nobody knows, but their target is always they finish after 100 days in session. In most years, they come around, try to get pretty close to that number. That's April 24th. So if everything goes well, and one of the things that I think about is I don't know of any of them that are having fun. It's not a fun place to be. So they're not going to want to go any longer than they have to. But that would be April 24th. Could be a little bit past that. I doubt if it would be much before that, but so you get some idea of when the legislature might finish up. A couple of bills I just want to talk about. Most of them would have some financial information that at least I would want to share with you. There is one bill that's passed and been signed by the governor. It's not a financial bill, but it's basically school employees, enrollment, and employment and discipline. And basically, it allows the Arizona Department, requires the Arizona Department of Education and the State Board of Education to investigate written complaints about non-certified employees for when it's unprofessional or immoral conduct. This had a lot to do with charter schools because their teachers aren't certified. So this would allow people, but it gets extended beyond charter schools. If you have an employee in your district who's in a non-certified position, the state board and Department of Ed can investigate like they do for certified teachers, and can make a ruling that that person is not allowed to be working in public schools anymore. But that has passed. That's House Bill 2023. Then one other one that isn't a financial one, but it's kind of interesting to show how at least sometimes the legislature doesn't do things that are as bad as they could be. School superintendent severance packages after the Paradise Valley school superintendent got a big severance package. They were trying to pass legislation that school districts could not do that. They were convinced that would make it even harder to get school superintendents. It would cause problems, and that bill never made it out of committee. So that bill hopefully won't be coming back this session. There is a bill 2179, which deals with school facilities and additional funding. It wouldn't affect most of you. It's still got a lot of problems to work out. But one of the problems is, and it's been this way for a couple of years, when the state school facilities board approves a new school, there's not enough money there to build it. Unless you can pass a bond or unless you get money from someplace else. And this would allow the state board to have a little more flexibility, state facilities board, to basically say when they approve a school and it's this size and of this type, and there's not enough money to build it, that they can give additional money to give enough money to have the contract fulfilled to build the school. That hasn't gone through, it's almost through the House, but that'll take some more work. But that's a good bill if it makes it all the way through the system. The other one that you might have heard about a little bit is House Bill 2555. And it's interesting. This is legislation to do something that's already there, but it would make it legally proper. Is right now the school facilities board operations have been moved from the school facilities board as a separate entity to the Department of Administration. And all of the money's being distributed. It's still school facility board rules and regulations. It's still a school facilities board that exists, but it's done through the Department of Administration. What I hear from most school districts is that they're doing a better job than the school facilities board did. They're turning things around more quickly, and they're getting information and getting money out to schools more quickly. And there's also $60 million that would go in there if this bill passes to help building renewal grants for school districts. But that's House Bill 2555. Then school instructional time. And again, this is a bill that has a lot of work to do. It's House Bill 2862. And it's instruction, and it's about ready to go through the whole House. It's in schools instructional time. Now, what this would do, and the Department of Ed is trying to figure out how they would even examine this in school districts because of all the components of it. But I'm sure many of your districts may have had trouble in the past, or you've heard of some problems with the Department of Ed. And it's not the Department of Ed's auditors that's the problem. It's the pretty strict time requirements that kids have to be there. And this basically would open it up quite a bit and provide a lot of flexibility. Instructional time, it can be direct instruction, project-based learning, independent learning time, include in-person instruction, remote instruction. It basically would allow you to count a lot. You still have to have a plan for how the students would get all of their time in, but you'd have a lot more flexibility in what time counts.
You know, it's interesting as that bill's moving forward, and we've got the fraud investigations going on with charter schools. I can't help but think that passing something like that would only open the door wider to the unscrupulous charter operators. Not all charter operators are unscrupulous, but some of them are, who are claiming, students as being in attendance when in fact they aren't. And I know that there were just some indictments, I think, that were handed down, I'll say last week, weren't there? Yeah.
Yes. It's always a hard thing to, do you over-regulate people to stop the few people who are dishonest? But at least this is the positive thing about this is it's bringing getting people's attention about having, especially in this world that we have today, with all the different options that students have, at least look at, are there some options besides a student just sitting in a classroom that should count towards the minimum time requirements? But that bill hasn't passed the House yet. It's getting close to, and then it'll go through the Senate. So remember, it's got a long way before it would probably make it through the whole session, but at least it is being discussed. The one bill, Senate Bill 1139, which has passed the Senate 29-0. And basically that bill, if it makes it through the whole process and gets signed by the governor, does a couple of major things. One is for the classroom site fund. It eliminates the buckets. You would not have 3 buckets anymore. You would just have a fund. And the second thing that it does, it allows, and the Counselors Association lobbied really heavily for this, it would allow student support services to be added to classroom services as allowable expenses out of the classroom site fund. And like I said, that passed the Senate 29-0. But it'll have to get through the House, and it'll get discussed again, and then it would have to be signed by the governor's office. But that'd be a really big change on the classroom site fund. Then another bill that's a positive one, but it hasn't gone through the system. I'm sorry, yes?
No. So going back to the classroom site fund bill, how is the issue of performance pay addressed in that?
You had that provision and you had to have a certain percentage of the money, and it basically takes that away. It looks like the final version will take that away. It still has performance pay in there, but it doesn't specify how it needs to be done. So districts would decide how they were going to have some, and it doesn't say a percentage of the money or anything like that. So it makes the requirement for performance pay very flexible.
Okay.
Then and this one is a good one, if it'll make it all the way through. It's Senate Bill 1433. It's passed the Senate 24-6, and it needs to go over to the House, but it's getting quite a bit of support. And basically, it would make distance learning for this year only at 100%, not 95%. But two things that are important, it clearly states it's only for this school year. And it would be a big plus. Right now, school districts are losing about $260 million because of only being funded at 95% for students on the time they're on distance learning. So at least 24 senators, obviously Republicans and Democrats, recognize the need to maybe take a look at that. Let's see, in the other finance bill, I think I have one more. Yeah, the aggregate expenditure limit. As we've notified people after the Department of Ed looked at it, is that we're not over this year, we're under this year because of all the kids that have been lost. So using revised budgets rather than the initial budgets, we're under the limit. So we're about $280 million under the limit. So there was two bills in the legislature going through the House and going through the Senate to override the limit for this year. Well, that legislation won't be needed, it doesn't look like. However, there is another provision, another bill going through on, it would have to go to the voters. So it would be something that would have to be put on the ballot in 22, which basically would reset the limit to the 22-23 school year. Right now, our constitutional limits based upon what was spent in 79-80, adjusted for inflation and adjusted for changes in students. This would start that process all over again and say whatever school district spent in 22-23, that becomes the base, and that would get adjusted for inflation and changes in students and 10%, because the way the Constitution is now, that 79-80 limit got adjusted by multiplied by 1.10 plus change for inflation and changes for changes in students. So that is a SCR 1021. It's got a ways to go or whatever, but if it did make it all the way through the process, it would have to go on the ballot in 22. So that's some of the legislation that obviously there's a lot more bills out there, but just kind of an overview of some of the ones that would affect funding. And I'll be glad to answer any questions that anybody would have on legislation or budget or anything else.
Chuck, we've got a couple that came up in the chat. The first from Shanna Johnson. What was the House bill for the classroom site fund changes you referenced?
Well, I don't remember. It's 1139 is I believe the Senate bill that's moving through, and then that bill either the House will move their own bill or and then change over to the Senate bill. The Senate bill I think was 1139.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got one more from Dr. Angelou. Is it possible to get a list of those bills? She missed the bill number for the site fund for schools that allow supplemental funding, as well as the night.
Yeah. I'll send you the bills that I talked about. I'll send you an email with their titles and their numbers, and then you can share that with the people.
Perfect.
That are on today.
Are there other questions that you have? Feel free to unmute, or you can put them in the chat and we'll monitor those as well. I have a question, and you may or may not know anything about it, but what's going on with the capital lawsuit? Any new information about
where that is it's been going on for a couple of years now. There's been a lot of depositions taken, a lot of information that each side has gathered through depositions. I think they're getting closer to finishing up that process, and then it'll start moving into the court looking at some of those arguments. But Annabelle Apatello has been working really closely with the attorneys who are representing the school districts on that lawsuit, and has put together some tremendous PowerPoints and tremendous dashboards that actually show what's happened over time. It's amazing how much more powerful it is to take one of those dashboards and show, here's where school districts have gone, here's where charter schools have gone, here's where we've gone with funding and stuff like that. How much more powerful a tool is that than just a list of here's each of those years or whatever. So she's done, and they really appreciate the work that she's been doing. So, and I think the advantage of that is it's got to be more helpful to a judge to see graphically what happened rather than just a bunch of numbers being thrown out there. What does it look like over time? So, but I do think, and I'm not positive, I think all the depositions that were needed have been taken, and now it'll start to move back into the courts. But it'll be a number of years, I would imagine, before it gets settled.
Well, and I think that the good thing is we've seen, you know, the DAA restoration. We've seen, you know, the bill that you were talking about that would provide a safety valve in funding for new construction, that, you know, if what's been initially appropriated isn't enough to cover the cost of construction to meet the minimum adequacy guidelines, that, you know, that there would be you know, a fund available. You know, I think a lot of that comes out of, you know, the pressure that's been applied by that that lawsuit. And I know, you know, back when the DAA restoration was first put on the table, there was some talk about, well, you know, could we see that as a settlement or not? And I think some parties did, some parties didn't. But it's been good to have that pressure there. I know for me, you know, as I've been trying to build a high school, you know, being able to go to, you know, Director Tobin's people and say, okay, I've talked to Danny Adelman and he really wants me to work with him on trying to pursue this lawsuit. How can you help me not want to do that? It's a lever, and it's something that I think, you know, schools and the system have been able to apply to great benefit.
I would agree that when the legislature's making decisions, they have to have that in the back of their mind. Well, how will this look to the courts? Will this make us look in a better position or whatever? And Andy Tobin has done, I believe, the people that he has that are running the school facilities board are driven by trying to provide services to schools. And I think part of that is if they make the SFB look like it's operating better, having less complaints, doing more things to help schools, that certainly the state will use that in their lawsuit. Yeah. So I agree with you, Sean, that lawsuit is certainly in the back of people's minds as they react to the needs of school districts. Now, some people could argue, and maybe it is true, they just want to do the right thing, or they want to do the right thing because of the lawsuit. It probably doesn't matter. We want them to do the right thing, and that's what the bottom line and what's most important.
Well, they had the opportunity to do the right thing for a long time without a lawsuit, and it wasn't happening. So
I agree.
Hey, two things that I would throw out there. One, I know you've been working hard to revamp the school finance system, and I'm not sure that there's a whole lot to share in this. I know we've used up a bunch of your time already. I mean, if there was one thing coming out of that process that you would want, you know, rural leaders to look forward to in a nutshell.
A little background on it, the Department of Ed has been well over a year, probably about a year and a half. They've been working on redoing the school funding, not the formula, but the processes that implement the formula. And I worked at the Department of Ed for a number of years, and so have other people. And it was always a battle between the IT people at the Department of Ed and the school finance people coming up with a system that worked. Right now, Lyle Friesen has to make tons, no, I shouldn't say tons, a significant amount of manual adjustments to make that formula work. And they're almost worried that if they make a change to the system, it may blow the whole system up because it's been around so long. So right now they're on target, possibly by July 1, to have a new system in place. And they've had a committee of school people. In fact, Sean was part of that group meeting with the IT people and the Department of Ed people, school finance people, to see how can that best work. So I think we'd have improved systems that wouldn't have so many manual adjustments to it. And also that would help school districts maneuver through all these different reports to find out how much money they're really getting and why are they getting and why did it change and things like that. So I think that's a positive thing that may be happening. I've never seen the Department of Ed, the school finance and the IT people work together any more closely. And Charlie Martin, who now works in school finance, does a lot of the day-to-day work at the school finance unit. So Lyle can devote more of his time to redoing those systems. So they're modern systems and they're systems that people serve people rather than just getting people's ways. So I think their current target is they may be having some of that being able to be implemented by July 1.
Yeah, it has been something to see, and I applaud Superintendent Hoffman for the efforts that she's made. You know, that was something from day one that was one of her priorities, and it'll make things better. I mean, getting rid of some of that old, you know, the A4 and the HR and some of the, you know, the reports that they're functional, but they're really not terribly 21st century. So thank you for your leadership on that.
It's Department of Ed people that have been doing that, and there still may be a CHAR report and an APOR report,
Right.
But there'll be modern reports. And one of the things we've really been striving for is, and as school districts, you can appreciate this, when your funding changes, you shouldn't have to spend hours trying to figure out why it changed. The Department of Ed ought to be able to tell you your student count changed, or your TEI changed, or your assessed valuation changed. That's why it's different. And hopefully one of the new systems will allow where people won't have to spend so much time figuring out why the change was there. The state can tell them what the change was, and then you can decide if that was a legitimate change or not. That would be a really big change in itself.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And I'm going to throw, before we end this though, there's one thing that I want to cover, you know, as we're all together, and that is with REAP funding. As you know, the deadline for filing your small rural school achievement program, your SRSA REAP grant is still April 15th.
Or your RLIS.
Well, and remember, RLIS goes through DME, and so that's included in your ESCA consolidated grant. Now, what you've got to be careful with this year is, you know, look at your eligibility. There are a couple districts that I identified, and there may be more out there that I didn't see, where in previous years it made sense, you know, that have dual eligibility. So you're eligible for either an RLIS or an SRSA. And in previous years, it made sense to go with the SRSA. Well, last February, the REAP division, the Title IX division in the Department of Education underwent an extensive audit, and there were a couple things that were identified where they found that some calculations weren't being done properly in prior years. In the end, it ended up turning into this whole big blow up over RLIS because some states were using the FERPL data, the free and reduced price meal data, to determine how many districts they had that were eligible when the law says you're supposed to use census data. Anyway, all of that aside, another element that seems to have come out of that is that your SRSA allocation or eligibility is limited by your Title II and your Title IV grant amounts. In prior years, they weren't including the Title IV grant amounts. And so For my district, we went from a $22,000 SRSA to an $8,000 SRSA when they reduced the amount of our allocation by our Title IV allocation. All of a sudden, our RLIS grant becomes a much larger option. And so we're having to switch. I'm having to switch from going with that SRSA application that you do directly to the Department of Education over to the RLIS application that you have to do through GME. That may change the things that you spend the money on because you've got obviously more scrutiny in GME than you ever had in G5. And so, there may be some planning things that you need to take into account when you're doing that. If that didn't happen to you this year, keep an eye out because it may be that your RLIS and your SRSA got much closer than they were in the past, and that's something you need to be conscious of in the future. But that's definitely something to, don't just presume that it is the way it was, because that audit that was done last February definitely kicked some things around, and it's a little different now. So I just want to make sure that, while we are all together, that we had the opportunity to share that information. So.
Great. Doesn't look like there are any other questions in the chat. So with that, Chuck, thank you again for joining us today. Always appreciate your expertise and thank you.
Well, thank all of you for what you're doing out there in the field in this most difficult year that anybody can remember. Your jobs are the most difficult, and anything that we could do to help with information, we're more than happy to try to do that.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Chuck.